Good morning and welcome to the 30th meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. I remind all members and witnesses to ensure that their devices are on silent. Evelyn Tweed MSP, Willie Coffey MSP and Mark Griffin MSP have all given their apologies. And the first item on the agenda is to decide whether to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are members agreed? We're agreed, thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence on the annual reports of the Ethical Standards Commissioner and the Standards Commission for Scotland for 2024 to 25. And we're going to hear from two panels, and we are joined first by Ian Bruce, who is the Ethical Standards Commissioner. I welcome Mr. Bruce to the meeting, and there's no need for you to operate your microphone. We'll do that for you. And I'd like to begin by inviting you to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener and members, for the opportunity to provide evidence today. I have prepared a brief opening statement, somewhat unusually, and it's in order to ensure that there is as much time as possible for questions to me today on the work of the office. I'd like to start by acknowledging that there have been some recent media articles that have sought to undermine the ethical standards framework in Scotland. I have two observations on these. The first relates to claims that only 2% of complaints over the preceding 5 years were ultimately upheld. It's a misleading narrative, and I'm taking this opportunity to call it out in what I consider to be the appropriate forum. The reality is that a great many complaints, roughly 2/3 overall, when discounting the occasional super complaint, which I'll come back to, relate to how well councillors perform their role or to council decisions, and they do not relate in any way to the ethical conduct of councillors. The super complaint, which you'll have seen from my last annual report and accounts, it related to a council decision on a planning matter. Now, whilst I empathise with the members of the public affected by such decisions, the code simply wasn't engaged. These councillors were just doing their job and cannot be found to be in breach of the code simply because the decision they took was unpopular. It's for this and similar reasons that many complaints aren't considered admissible. As the committee will be aware, complaint numbers can provide an indication of the depth of feeling that the public may have about issues, but my office does also provide statistical information on cases. All similar complaints are grouped into cases, as was done for the super complaint, and case numbers therefore provide a more accurate reflection of the number accepted for investigation and of those the number that result in a breach finding. Since I took over as Commissioner, I've consistently accepted 1/3 or more of all complaints for investigation, returning to the same level of acceptance that was in place prior to my predecessor. Of these legitimate complaints that are accepted because they could represent a breach of the code on its face, the average percentage of breach findings in the prior 4 years was just under 23%. And if I could refer the members to Exhibit A in the annual report and accounts, that gives a very true picture of admissibility figures. For the first 2 quarters of this financial year, just under 26% of admissible cases resulted in a breach report. And also for the first 2 quarters of this year, I can report that there's been a 68% rise in cases in respect of councillors in comparison with the last financial year. Despite these increases, we're still meeting our KPIs for time taken for reaching decisions on admissibility and for investigations. The committee will also be aware that a proportion of the no-breach findings in these cases will be due to the enhanced right to freedom of expression that councillors are entitled to under the European Convention on Human Rights. In other words, they may have acted with discourtesy and disrespect, but in my view, a restriction on their rights could not be justified. I have a second observation for the committee, and it's simply to note that a number of the individuals quoted in these media articles have a personal and vested interest in undermining the ethical standards framework. My own view is that the system the Scottish Parliament has put in place to maintain good conduct in public life is more important than the vested interests of a handful of people who wish to publicly undermine the system. I'm now happy to take any questions that the committee may have for me.
Thanks very much for that. I just want to, so thanks for those two observations and getting those on the record. And it is quite concerning that there are people that are kind of keen to undermine it. Would you be willing to say a bit more about vested interests? Is that appropriate?
Because we're talking about live cases, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to speak. Whether or not it's appropriate for those subject to live cases to speak publicly about them, perhaps would be a matter for the committee to take a view on.
Okay. Thanks for that. I mean, I think we've got some questions later on that will touch in on some of the other bits that you've said, but I'd just like to pick up a general question. I've got a few questions, but generally I'd like to just explore the complaint level. So the trend in complaints seems to have gone up. Of course, you've got the super complaint piece that makes it look like it's extremely high. But I'd just like to get a sense from you about that level and the trend so far in 2025 to 26.
Yes, definitely been an increase. So 68% increase in the first 2 quarters of this year in comparison with the first 2 quarters of the last financial year. Significant. And again, discourtesy and disrespect is driving those numbers up.
Discourtesy and disrespect by councillors to each other or to others?
Yes, and to members of the public, and in some cases to officers.
Okay. So again, we'll probably dig into that maybe a bit more as we go on. Last time you were here, you talked about the need to improve productivity within the team, within your office. I'd be interested to understand how that's progressed, and maybe has this been, part of the numbers going up? Is that part of the productivity? Are they connected?
Possibly, but only in a sort of vague sense. So my view is that part of the reason that complaint numbers are going up is because I think there's more trust in the system now than there may have been previously. The system, for what it's worth, is operating precisely as it should be at this point in time. There's more public visibility, so there are media reports about saying the system isn't working well, but equally, there are others that are saying that it is. There's more visibility, and I think people feel more able to complain as a consequence of that. But equally, the nature of debate, I think, is driving complaint numbers up also. And the nature of the debate sometimes, depending on the matter that's under discussion, can be quite toxic in nature. So that's certainly driving complaint numbers up as well. In terms of productivity, we've got no control whatsoever about the type of complaints and the number of complaints that are submitted to us. But it's incumbent on us to basically get through those complaints as quickly as we possibly can. That's better for the system. People aren't waiting for a long time to hear about the outcome of their initial complaint. And equally, people who are subject to investigation shouldn't have to wait for a long time for that investigation to be completed. You'll have seen for the annual report numbers that increases in productivity had improved waiting times and also improved investigation times. We now have a live page on our website that's updated quarterly, so that the public can see exactly how long they have to wait for us to get through complaints. And in the second quarter of this financial year, the initial investigation time, that's stage 1, so the decision on admissibility is currently sitting at 45 days, so that's a big improvement again this year. And stage 2 is sitting at 4.7 months on average, so again, major improvements in productivity, and those were due to quite a number of measures that we introduced in order to get through these complaints more quickly, but without any diminution in quality.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the measures?
Yes, of course. So we have a duty IO role, duty investigating officer role that we introduced. So each week, one of our investigating officers is assigned to that particular role and task, and primarily it's about triaging complaints from the prior week. So in effect, what we're doing is looking at complaints live, as opposed to in previous years where we had a bit of a backlog. That's all gone in effect. So we're looking at complaints live, and the triage system is to determine whether or not there has been a breach on the face of the code. If there hasn't, then that complaint can be dismissed very quickly. But the other role that they fulfil is very, very frequently we do receive complaints that are unclear, that make vague allegations, that aren't specific about the conduct that's of concern to the complainer. So it means that we have an opportunity to get back to that complainer as quickly as we possibly can, while the concern is still fresh in their minds, and ask them for additional information in order to create what we call a statement of complaint. So that's happened, and alongside it, in tandem with that, we introduced what's known as our complaints allocation plan. We classify admissible complaints with a red, amber, green rating, and that depends on issues such as complexity, number of witnesses that may have to be interviewed, etc. And we use that complaint allocation plan to assign cases to the different investigating officers so that they've got a good case mix. And over and above that, we've made it very clear to the entire team that the KPIs we have as an office are very important to us. They're very important to our stakeholders. So we have some systems in place whereby they can track how they're doing against those KPIs in relation to both admissibility and to the different stages of an investigation that they undertake. And then over and above that, we've introduced quite a few other measures to improve on productivity. So we've enhanced our complaint management system, so basically leveraging the technology that's available to us to do things better, and we've automated a number of systems as well. And we are moving to a 35-hour working week next year because that's the SPCB in effect sets our terms and conditions for the staff. So for the past year, all staff have been engaged in quarterly meetings to discuss, and it's my firm view that the staff in any team, the people who are doing the work day to day, recognise themselves how to improve on what they do, how to realise efficiencies. So that's been a focus of our work over the past year as well, and we are confident we can move across to that 35-hour working week without it impacting on KPIs or the quality of our work.
Moving from how many hours currently? 37. 37, okay. Yep. That sounds great. It's, clearly you've got some really good systems in place. I like the idea of the duty officer investigation role where it's rotating, so it's not one person doing that all the time. People get to see that part of the workflow, but then also go deeper into other cases. And also the allocation bit where you're thinking clearly about a good balance of casework. Yeah. Last year when you were here, we recommended after the evidence session that that you gather data that the Commission gather data relating to the sex and gender of complainers and respondents. Can you give us an update on how that's going?
Yes, by all means. So it's part of a wider picture of measures. So myself and the Standards Commission for Scotland have joined alongside a number of stakeholder organisations, so including the Joe Cox Foundation, Police Scotland, etc. It's called the Round Table on Civility in Public Life. They've held 2 meetings thus far and are in the process of developing a more detailed action plan. So we have some actions agreed already, some of which I think need to be more fully formed and become a bit smarter. But there are some actions in there potentially for my office. I think when I wrote to the committee, I'd said I would need to consult COSLA on a measure such as this because it would be quite difficult to implement without agreement from councils. But that is a firm proposal now that's going before COSLA leaders, and in the event that they agree to it, I will introduce that measure from the start of the next financial year, and we will gather that data where people are willing to give it to us, of course. And
in terms of the wider measures, what else are you considering bringing
in? So more public discourse. I tend not to use social media, nor do the staff, simply because some platforms, generate an awful lot of complaints in and of themselves. The nature of the debate going on in them. But I do use LinkedIn, and I've spoken quite publicly using that particular platform, which is a professional one and well moderated. About the damage that incivility in public life is doing to our democracy. So making a range of public statements. There's the work of Police Scotland in terms of safeguarding for councillors. That's included in the action plan. So a whole range of activities, but for different organisations who have agreed to join up with the round table. The Standards Commission continues to produce and update its guidance, for example, intended to assist councillors to fulfil their role in an appropriate way. The Improvement Service is also a partner there. Audit Scotland, as I understand it, is going to be asked to join, and I've got a couple of meetings lined up with Audit Scotland to be talking about this very subject. Again, alongside the Standards Commission, we have relatively regular meetings now with the Improvement Service and with Audit Scotland to identify hotspot areas, in effect, where incivility may be having an impact on good governance. So quite a range of measures, but more to be adopted.
Yeah, that's great, and more kind of cross-body communication that seems to be very constructive. I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher with a number of questions.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Ian. I'll touch firstly on the number of complaints fully investigated by the ESC. My understanding is that it's 142 complaints for 24-25. I think I can already anticipate what you're going to say here, but if you could give us a little bit more information on the reason for these the number of complaints, as they have doubled, but also if you could go into a little bit more detail on the impacts of resource as well on the Commissioner.
Sure. So again, perhaps just important to draw a distinction between complaints and cases, because I think you're talking about case numbers that we managed to get through in that year. Complaints were a bit lower last year in comparison with the prior financial year, but the number of cases that we managed to get through were fundamentally down to the improvements that we'd managed. It's a bit of a balancing act, so we've got two stages, one admissibility and two's investigation. The fewer complaints that we get in, the easier it is for us to get through admissibility decisions, and the more resource we can dedicate to complaint handling. So alongside the other measures I've explained, that was how we managed to get through so many cases in that financial year.
No, thank you very much for that. But also the reasons, again, for the number of complaints doubling, does that go back to the public discourse that you've mentioned? But also, perhaps, you might have a bit of councillor on councillor spats, and I think we'll go into more questions on that later, but could that be another factor as well?
Sure. So, yes, the public is complaining quite a lot. I think in this financial year it's sitting at about 83%. It was about 80% last year. So it tends to be relatively steady around that level. Councillor on councillor complaints, there had been an increase last year. It's gone down a bit this year. I think it's sitting at around 13% at the moment. And then officer complaints, which are, relatively rare in comparison with others. I think they are currently sitting at around 4%. But all sorts of things drive numbers up, to be honest with you. International events like the conflict in the Middle East, believe it or not, drives complaint numbers up. But then closer to home, the debate between those who are in favour of gender self-identity as opposed to those who hold gender-critical views. In the aftermath of the Supreme Court judgment, people were saying things about each other online, and that drove complaint numbers up. But it's a real mix. And when it comes to discourtesy and disrespect, yes, online, quite a lot of it is generated there, but equally microaggressions during committee meetings, surgeries, you name it really. And quite a lot of it, I'd said, roughly two-thirds of the complaints we receive are dismissed. Quite a lot of it is simply because people are disgruntled because, as a constituent, they feel they're not getting what they want out of their councillor. And the ballot box is really where, they express those concerns. But it's really nothing to do with councillors acting inappropriately. It's simply that they're not doing precisely what their constituent wants. So it's a mix.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. And my last question is on the expenditure by ESC, which has had about, I think, roughly about a 60% real terms increase over the last 10 years. Again, just to have a little bit more of an insight as to what the reasons are for this increase, but also does that current spend represent good value for public money?
Yes. I think in response to your last question, you would be the judge of that, and so would the public be. What I can say, and just return to this, is I think the system is working precisely as it should now, and precisely as Parliament intended. In terms of my overall budget, roughly 80% of that is on staff, and the staff are all working incredibly hard to do the best that they possibly can for the full range of stakeholders that we have. In terms of increases, historically the committee will be aware, and I've seen the briefing papers for today, that the office had some issues. There was a Section 22 report. All of that's in the past. Every recommendation that we've had from both external and internal auditors. Those have all been met, fulfilled. So we are doing well as an office from my perspective, but in order to do as well as we are doing, we did need to increase our staff complement, which is one of the first recommendations that our auditor made. More recent increases, I in effect had to replace the entire investigations team because of what had happened historically. And what that means is we've got a relatively new team still in place. They go up their pay scale every year because they are on SPCB staff terms and conditions. There's also the incremental increase that all staff get every year. And then over and above that, national insurance contributions went up. So that accounts more or less for the entire increase. We have very little extraneous spends. We spend next to nothing on legal advice, for example. We try to do far and away the majority of the work that we're required to do in-house.
That's great. Thank you very much for your time, Ian.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. And I'm now going to move online and bring Fulton McGregor in.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Ian. It's my question. Well, first question's around about the super complaint that you've already referenced both in the annual report and you've referenced it in your opening statement. Obviously, you can't clearly can't give any personal information away about it, but are you able to tell us a wee bit more about that? Because that seems to take up, it seems to be a big part of your opening remarks. What was the nature of the super complaint, or not the nature, sorry, but what was the sort of issues around it? Can you tell us a wee bit more about the super complaint? Sure. Obviously, what you can tell us.
Yeah. So the reason I mentioned it was because I'm concerned that there's a narrative out there that lots of complaints aren't upheld. Very, very few complaints get investigated. That's not the truth, and it's because things like super complaints inflate the figures. So a great many complaints came in, and anyone can complain to me at any point in time if they've got concerns about people's conduct. But the reality was, in that case, it was about a council's decision on a planning application. So we had lots of members of a local community, each of whom individually wanted to complain. So they complained collectively, but each of them individually wanted their complaint lodged about the members of a council who had voted in a particular way on a planning decision. So they had no conflict of interest. There was, in effect, no part of the code engaged. The members of the public were simply unhappy with a council decision on a planning application. So it didn't mean all that much work for us because we took them all in as a single case. They were all dismissed as a single case. But it does inflate the numbers because, in effect, they weren't complaining about ethical conduct.
Yeah, well, that was actually my next question on it. The resource implications for you there. You're saying that the resource implications of that particular super complaint weren't overly onerous then?
That's correct, because so we do use information technology and we use the systems available to us in order to do what we need to do as quickly as we can. So in a case like that, we would set up an interim database. And we can use a mail merge function to ensure that everyone who's complained gets an individualised letter responding to that complaint. But it doesn't mean someone sitting down and typing 1,000 letters out. We use technology in order to get through these things as quickly as we can.
Thanks, Ian. And what else would sort of count as a super complaint? That was a pretty good example you gave there, sure. And I can see how that would come in. But would a flurry of complaints about, say, an individual councillor count, or would they all be treated individually?
It would depend. If it was all about the same conduct, they would all be treated as a single case, those complaints. I wouldn't categorise that as a super complaint. I think once you get beyond sort of 100, and it would depend on the nature and complexity of complaints, but we've only ever recorded 2 in my time. And one was in relation to members of this place as opposed to councillors. But we have an extensive investigations manual, which I haven't mentioned. It's quite a dry read, but it is extensive. And it covers everything that we do in relation to complaint handling, and it's even got a section on how we handle super complaints. So when those arise, all the staff know what to do in order to deal with those appropriately.
Okay, and you've already said that the majority of complaints received in 2024-25 were from members of the public. How many of these were admissible? And do you feel that there's a lack of knowledge or understanding, perhaps, about the role and scope amongst the public? Is that something to pick up on?
It's an issue. So I think the first 2 quarters of this year we're sitting at roughly 36% admissible. But you're right. So members of the public do complain about things that fundamentally don't fall within our purview and that don't engage the code. When I was here last, I'd said we were setting up an accessibility working group from the different teams within the office. So that's well established and is working well now. And in January of this year, we wrote and published 3 easy read guides for members of the public that explain in the simplest possible terms what you can and can't complain about, what does engage the code and what doesn't. Over and above that, the Standards Commission for Scotland continuously updates its own guidance for members of the public. So, there's a card that councillors can use with members of the public. They've got explanatory videos, a separate page for members of the public. Notwithstanding that, I think the reality is people just get angry sometimes, and all sorts of things can make them angry. So just to give you another simple example, if someone's individual planning application is refused, then they will seek to engage the code, saying things like, these individuals who made that decision on my planning application fail to show leadership and honesty and that type of thing, and might indulge in a bit of hyperbole, when in fact they've acted perfectly ethically. They've just, they've reached a decision on a planning application. So I feel that people sometimes try to use the principles in the code to construct a complaint that in effect doesn't have any merit, and they've got nowhere else to go, frankly, and that's, I think, why they come to the office, because they feel if they say enough and they say it in such and such a way, we might be inclined to investigate. I mean, one thing I should mention is we've actually seen the rise of AI for complaint generation, and hundreds of pages generated by AI. It's not always that easy to tell, but sometimes it is. And we can't just dismiss this stuff. We need to go through all of that in order to determine whether a complaint's got merit. But that's increasing the workload a bit as well.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, because I think I speak probably for my colleagues as well. We're beginning to get a lot more constituent queries that are AI done as well, and they're, as you said, they're as relevant as if they weren't AI, because it's still the constituents' query. Convener, if it's okay with yourself, I've got another quick question, if that's all right. It's relating to one of your earlier ones.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So the convener had asked you earlier about the committee's request last year about gathering information relating to the sex or gender of complainants. I wanted to ask a wee bit more about that. I want, when you're looking at complaints that are coming in, just say, for example, it's about a councillor on councillor conduct, are you looking at if there's patterns emerging between, if there's particular councillors who perhaps are male, let me just say who are male, and they're particularly targeting female councillors, because we know in the Scottish Parliament, I'm sure you're aware, Ian, as well, that it's a difficult place for women in politics. And I know through speaking to councillors in the past and such like, that they can feel it can be a difficult environment. Is that something you and your team look at when complaints come in and try and make an assessment on that, or is it really just quite a strict kind of X, Y and Z? Is that something that's in your mind?
Oh, absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. It's not the only reason I joined the COSLA round table, but it's one of the reasons. And we have been conducting our own research. I mean, I've got limited resources, and clearly when complaint numbers are high, we need to dedicate that to investigations. But equally, our hearings and investigations officer, so a senior officer within the office, is conducting research and also interrogating our own data. So she did have an in-depth look at what was going on over 24-25. It's a very mixed picture in terms of disrespectful conduct, and we're not in a position to reach any conclusions yet. But we know for a fact, particularly anecdotally, because people get in touch with us and tell us how upset they are, that they've been complained about or the type of conduct that they've been subjected to. So we know anecdotally there's an issue there. The Duty IO role, part of that is horizon scanning. So they do look to see whether or not new complaints that are coming in can be linked to something else that's going on, perhaps in a local authority. Because you can see when things are not going particularly well in a local authority, you get a lot of tit-for-tat complaints. And I think the only other thing just to mention on gathering demographic data, I don't believe that there's a hierarchy, so we will be gathering all demographic data from people where they're wanting to provide it, and hopefully if people are willing to provide it, and we'll certainly make a good case for that as and when we set it up, subject to COSLA's agreement. But hopefully people will submit it, and we'll be able to form a better view on precisely what's happening. I do like to base my decisions on evidence, and at the moment a lot of that is more qualitative than it is quantitative.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, Fulton. I'm now going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning and good to see you.
Morning.
The Code of Conduct is probably now quite embedded in the way that councils operate and that councillors and officials. And in your report this year, there's about 40 complaints come from either councillors or council officers, and there's about 44 complaints are about disrespect or discourtesy during a council meeting or a board meeting. So individuals are aware of the parameters to work amongst, and so are officials or officers. But there is a role for the local authority monitoring officer as well in this whole process. So it would be good to get a feeling from you of what you see within that, because as I say, we now have a standard of way of working. There's parameters that officials and councillors need to work amongst. But the monitoring officer is there to try and ensure. And you've said that some councils are a bit more toxic or a bit more challenging, depending on their makeup and the way that they operate as a council. And they're not all doing the same. So it would be good to get a flavour as to what you think the role of that monitoring officer is, and how that helps or maybe it doesn't help. Maybe it engages and creates some things within a council.
I think they're vitally important, and we engage with them on a very regular basis. So the Standards Commission for Scotland has an annual workshop that we attend for monitoring officers, and it provides them with an opportunity to discuss their role. We also have regular meetings together with SOLAR, so that's in effect the society of those monitoring officers. They play an incredibly important role, and it's in respect of legal compliance more generally. So councils have all sorts of legal obligations, and the Code of Conduct sits within that wider framework of obligations that councils have, and they are there in effect to provide advice, both to officers but to councillors, regardless of party, about the way in which they ought to conduct themselves. I think when things become problematic is when either that advice isn't heeded or it isn't sought at all. And that tends to be when issues arise. But it's a bit like training on the code. So, the people who are keen on the code and on compliance with the code will come to the training. Those that aren't won't. And similarly, if opportunities to seek advice from the proper officer, who's the monitoring officer in those cases, when the opportunity to seek that advice arises, people who are keen to ensure that they operate within the parameters of the code will go and seek it, and those that aren't that keen won't. And clearly it tends to be the the councillors whose behaviours are problematic who fall foul of the code and they won't have followed monitoring officer advice or sought it at all. Yeah.
Okay. And there is still a relatively small number of complaints that come from, but we've seen a slight increase as well when it comes to complaints about councillors coming from council officials.
Yes.
So that there seems to be some pressure being put on council officers by councillors, or it would appear that there's a bit of tension, and then the officer themselves feel that they need to rein that councillor in some shape, way or form. And the code of conduct is a way of doing that. And if I can think back even to my time, I mean, I've been out of it now for 10 years,
Sure.
but the code of conduct was used against me occasionally to say, well, you know, if you do that, then we might have to go down that route. But when you're trying to find out information or gain information about specifics, there has to be trust between the councillor and the official. And if that trust breaks down in any shape, way or form, then the code could be used as a weapon to create some... and I wonder how if you think that is the case, that it is being used in some ways to stymie and to stop and to manage some of that, or is it just the role within the official who thinks, well, I'm the professional in this process, and you may have a complaint or a justification to inquire, but you need to go to a certain level, and if you overstretch that mark, then my professionalism could be compromised, or there's an attitude that, you know, I'm here to dictate or I'm here to give that. It would be good, because they're obviously increasing because there is that tension between the councillor and the official, and the councillor wanting information or seeking information, and the official feeling, well, you know, I can give you so much, or I have to adhere to some levels of that. But there obviously continues to be that tension, and it would be good to see, because if that is a problem and that is increasing, there has to be some kind of structure behind that.
So, as I say, as things stand this year, we're looking at roughly 4% of complaints come from officers, and they're not coming from monitoring officers. No. You know, it tends to be officers who feel that they've been disrespected, been treated discourteously. So it's a very, very small proportion of what comes to me. And so, notwithstanding what you've said, it tends to be that when an officer complains, they certainly feel that they're in extremis. I mean, what I hear from officers is, if you complain about a councillor, particularly a senior councillor, that can be a career-ending event for you. Again, we need to interrogate our data going back further years, but my view is that officers probably were very, very reticent about complaining when the office wasn't operating in the way that it should, because they might have to wait 2 years to get a decision. I mean, I personally can't imagine what that must feel like as an officer, being in that position, waiting for the outcome of what you feel to be a legitimate complaint, while, you know, that councillor who, in your view, has behaved disgracefully towards you, you're still having to work with them on a daily, weekly, you know, annual basis. So I'm certainly not seeing evidence of the code being perhaps weaponised in the way that you're suggesting. There is an education piece there, and again, I think this is where it's very important that the standards come in, because the Standards Commission comes in, because that's statutorily part of their remit. But there are plenty of ways in which councillors can legitimately criticise the work of officers without making personal, gratuitous comments about them. So it's fine to criticise the work. It's where you stray into criticism of the individuals that, you know, in effect, you could be in breach of the code. And I would expect monitoring officers to say to a councillor on those occasions, do you understand the difference? And, you know, this is the appropriate way to go about criticising the council, criticising the administration, criticising the work of officers without straying into that personal and gratuitous commentary. Yeah.
And I also think that, you know, when being a member of a council administration and being a member of a council opposition, you're not given the same information from time to time. You may be seconded with an official who's there to support, but in some cases that's not available. So that there are a disadvantage sometimes an opposition councillor in trying to understand or be given, so they have to try and find their way through that process. And that can be frustrating, and that can lead to a little bit of distrust amongst the councillors and the officials. And you know, when you get to a joint board situation where you have people from health and council there, but you have councillors trying to manage both of those, that can sometimes be conflictual, because officials from the health board and officials from the council don't always see eye to eye about what they want out of that process, and the council has to try and manage the tightrope between them and sort the problem. So I can see where there may well be other opportunities within boards and other locations where there's a difficulty. But I think it's been good for you to explain as to where you are in that process, Ian, because I think that's the way forward. Thank you. My last question is about the reopening of previously closed cases. And there's been a number that has been dealt with, and you touched on that within the annual report, stating because of the... So it would be quite good for you to maybe provide some more information about why that is the case and what merits the reopening of a previously closed case.
Sure. So I did obviously read through the annual report again, and I think I know the footnote that you're referring to, but there was only one case that was reopened, and the reason it was reopened was because the Standards Commission has three options when I submit a report to it. They can either take no action, or they can direct for further investigation, or they can decide to hold a hearing. And in one case during that financial year, I was directed for further investigation. So in effect, that's why it was reopened, because it was closed in our system when we submitted the report, but then direct for further investigation, we reopen it. There are other grounds that, you know, potentially might lead me to reopen a complaint, but they're really, really narrow. So, but a good example would be, you know, some substantive fresh evidence coming to light that had never been provided to me previously would lead me to reopen an investigation.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, that concludes our questions. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I think it's been very helpful to get a little bit of detail on the annual report and all the other activities that you're doing that kind of surround that as well. So thank you very much for your evidence, and I'm now going to briefly suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
get going. For our second panel, we're joined by Lorna Johnson, who's the Executive Director, and Suzanne Vestry, who's the convener of the Standards Commission for Scotland. And I welcome you both to the meeting. There's no need for you to turn on your microphones, as we will do that for you. And I'd like to begin by inviting Susie to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, convener and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing us to make a short opening statement and to answer any questions you might have on our most recent annual report. The Standards Commission has two full-time and two part-time members of staff, which makes a 3.1 full-time equivalent. During the period covered by this report, Lorna was the only full-time staff member, and as the Executive Director, she is the accountable officer. The Commission has 5 part-time members appointed by the parliamentary corporate body with the agreement of the Parliament. As convener, I'm contracted to work the equivalent of 3 days per month, while the remaining members each work 2 days. Members also sit on hearing panels as and when required. I'd like to highlight 3 main aspects of our work arising in the year 24-25. The first of these is trends in casework. The Standards Commission received 69 referrals from the Ethical Standards Commissioner during that period, and that was an increase of 19 or 27% on the previous year, and we held hearings in respect of 15 of those. At those 15 hearings, a breach of the applicable code was found in 11 cases, with 8 full or partial suspensions being applied. While our remit covers both councillors and board members, all but 1 of the hearings concerned councillors. 9 of those 15 hearings were held online and live streamed on our website in accordance with our practice of doing so where there's little dispute between parties and there are few witnesses. The remainder of our hearings were held in person at the headquarters of the Respondents' Council or public body, so that the local press and the public were able to attend. Of those 15 hearings, 8 concerned alleged breaches of the courtesy and respect or bullying and harassment provisions of the code. As a supplementary point, and to confirm the trend we highlighted last year, the majority of the hearings held or scheduled so far until the end of February in the current reporting year again concern respect-type behaviours. Over the past 2 years, we've also seen an increase in challenging behaviour from respondents and other service users. As this is both disruptive and detrimental, it's had a significant impact on our small staff team and has led in part to us providing resilience training to staff and members. We understand there's been media coverage suggesting that the code is preventing effective scrutiny. We refute this entirely and note that it is entirely possible for councillors to scrutinise effectively without falling foul of the provisions in the code that concern courtesy, respect, bullying, harassment and relations with officers. My second point, and these 2 points are shorter, is delivery. In terms of our finances, we finished the year in this annual report slightly under budget. This is a great credit to the staff team. We have received positive reports from our internal and external auditors on our financial and governance arrangements and continue to perform well against a range of challenging KPIs. We regularly review our risk profile and take steps to manage and mitigate against identified risks. Member and staff costs continue to comprise over 87% of the overall budget, meaning we're limited in terms of being able to identify new development areas, work streams and savings. We have nevertheless continued to fulfil our statutory role, meet our objectives and have been able to agree all requests to provide and run training events. Which takes me on to education. We note when we appeared before you last year, we were asked about the training we were able to provide. In the last year, we've been able to provide training sessions for 4 local authorities, 4 public bodies, and conducted with the Improvement Service 3 webinars that were open to all councillors on confidentiality, identifying and managing conflicts of interest, and quasi-judicial and regulatory decision-making. During this reporting period, we were able to publish revised guidance on the code and a new advice note on quasi and judicial decision-making as well as 6 revised sets of advice notes, a new information card for members of the public, Ian's already mentioned that, and a new e-learning course on confidentiality. Finally, I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues to continue our work to promote adherence to the codes and take action when they've been breached in order to ensure public confidence in those in public life and the organisations they represent. We'll be conducting surveys of councillors, council monitoring officers, members of devolved public bodies and their standards officers to learn more about their experiences in complying with the codes. We'll continue to work with partner organisations such as the Improvement Service to further develop our education and training materials. We also intend to continue to focus on educating the public on the framework, both so they're aware of the standards they can expect of those in public life and also to manage their expectations about what councillors and members may be able to achieve. In summary, despite our limited size and resources, I believe we continue to achieve a great deal. Standards in public life and freedom of expression within the code matters more now than ever. I hope this has been a helpful introduction to and summary of our work.
Yeah, thank you very much, Suzanne. That's been very helpful to get that overview and for you to highlight those 3 main points. And actually, I wanted to pick up on the education piece to start off. So it's great to hear the revision of the guidance, advice notes, easy reads for the members of the public. Lorna, if I could ask you, maybe it's early days in terms of doing all of that, but I just would like to get a sense on your thoughts around the training and are you seeing a change because of that?
I think Ian mentioned it earlier, but I think the people that attend the training are the ones that really want to abide by the code. So, yes, in terms of we see far less, I think I talked about this last year, but inadvertent breaches, so the failure to register interest, the failure to declare interest, the quasi-judicial and regulatory decision-making types of breaches. So we are seeing less of those, and I think that is a result of the training and the educational material. But unfortunately, the types of breaches that are more maybe, spontaneous, unplanned, just kind of poor behaviours, I think they are continuing, unfortunately.
Okay, and what are your thoughts around, because we discussed last time around making that code of conduct training mandatory, and we've heard back from local authorities. Be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think when we wrote to all the local authorities, I think the vast majority came back and said that essentially while they couldn't make it mandatory, they couldn't force councillors to come along, that they always provided it, and the majority did go along. We've actually recently we've been trying to focus more on, rather than individual councils. I think the committee noted last time that it would take us a long time to get round all 32 councils if we're only doing 4 a year, for example. So we've been trying to focus on that work with the Improvement Service, so it's open for all councillors. We've got 2 webinars coming up in January. One on one's on helping them distinguish between operational and strategic matters. And I think that's quite an important one in terms of relationships with officers. So we've got that one coming up, and also one in gifts and hospitality. And they're open to all councillors to come along. They're recorded, so even if councillors can't come on the day, they can watch them back. We recently did, we were invited by the Conservative Councillors Association to do an open training session for all their councillors, which was great, and there was really good involvement and discussion at that, really good interaction, and we're hoping that other political parties will do the same, because we think some of these behaviours could be improved if there was kind of internal policing within the party groups.
And how are you hoping? How are you hoping that will happen? Are you going to engage with the parties?
Yeah, we are. We engaged with all the political parties before the last election to see if we could run similar events, but we really didn't have much interest at the time, which I think maybe the timing wasn't great on our part, because it was just before an election, and I'm sure they've got campaigning activities that they're more interested in doing. But we will be doing that. We'll be going out and offering that to all the other parties.
Okay. Great, thank you for that update. I'd be interested to hear around your thoughts around the the 2021 Code of Conduct, whether that's improved standards and behaviour, how that's being measured, if at all, and what your sense is in terms of improvement of outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the changes that were made to the code in late 2021, I think it really clarified the provisions. My own view is the previous version of the code was quite difficult to understand. You know, I was sitting down on a day-to-day basis looking at the code, and I was still having to reread, especially the sections and declarations of interest. I was having to reread those a lot. So I think it's definitely helped in terms of the behaviours that I was talking about, the failure to declare, the failure to register. I think there's a much greater awareness of what would amount to a declarable interest. For example, now, I think the code really makes it clear what's expected of councillors when they are making those quasi-judicial and regulatory decisions, the licensing and planning type decisions. So I think that's really helped. As Susie mentioned, we're going to be doing surveys of councillors, monitoring officers, plus public body board members and standards officers next year. So it'll be the start of the next financial year. We'll issue those surveys. We did similar surveys 5 years ago, so we should be able to compare the results. We've not necessarily done much work on the questions yet, but we will think about the types of questions that we want to ask to get the most valuable information out of those. And I think the questions will be about the types of behaviours that they experience, that they witness, but also there will be questions about, you know, do you find the code easy to understand? How do you find our training material? What more can we do? Those types of questions as well.
Okay, great. And Susie, actually in your opening, you mentioned it was actually great to get the breakdown of the staffing and all of what you accomplish with such a small team. But the expenditure of the Ethical Standards Commissioner and the Standards Commission was over £2 million in 2024 to 2025. How do I put this? So is that value for money? In what way are we getting value for money for the public purse?
Yeah. Well, I think you are getting value for money. I think, as Suzanne mentioned, I think standards in public life are incredibly important, especially at the moment. I think the public has a right to expect that councillors and members of public bodies will act in their best interest and act ethically, and that if they don't, then action will be taken. I think in England, for example, they are now, I think, going to introduce a more centralised system again, because I think they realise from our experiences and the experiences in Wales and Northern Ireland that it's actually quite essential to have one for that public confidence. We also think that the codes help protect councillors and members. It's not just a tool with which to, attack them. You know, it actually helps them because it helps them demonstrate that they're acting ethically, that there's not this kind of, I think, 1970s sort of feeling of, backhanded envelopes being handed out, that kind of thing. So, I think, sorry, there's a long-winded way of saying, yes, I think you are getting value for money.
But it's good to get a bit of more around that. And I mean, it's interesting that you say that it's helped to shift the perception away from that 1970s backhanded. But I do think there's still in pockets across the country, certainly in my work, I kind of come across people who still have that kind of mistrust. So I think maybe I'm just confirming that the work that you do is absolutely essential.
Yeah, and I do think some of that mistrust may arise from the actual behaviours, the more respect-type behaviours. If councillors are throwing around unfounded accusations against each other, then that doesn't exactly help public confidence. So I think that ties into the breaches of the code that relate far more to respect and bullying and harassment. But we're not seeing those types of behaviours. We're not seeing many complaints about things like acceptance of gifts and hospitality that shouldn't have been accepted. We're really not seeing those types of, even when we're seeing breaches of the code that relate to declarations of interest, they tend to be, in our opinion, based on a misunderstanding. They tend to be inadvertent rather than someone who's deliberately trying to conceal an interest, for example. But yeah, as I said, I think the failure to behave respectfully towards each other doesn't help the public perception.
Yeah. Okay, great, thanks. Going to move on and I'm going to bring in Fulton McGregor, who's joining us online.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. Apologies there to maybe second to get my mic up. Thanks very much for the evidence so far. I wanted to ask a question around about your views on the public awareness of the code. Do you think that there is a good public awareness, or do you feel that the large number of complaints which are deemed inadmissible suggests that there isn't a great awareness there? I'm just really looking for your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think it's mixed, to be honest, and that's something that we've really focused on in the past 2 years, and we're continuing to focus on, is educating the public. As Ian mentioned, we've created a video for members of the public. We've created a whole advice note explaining what the code does and doesn't cover. We've also created it's a little card that councillors can take along to their constituents, their surgeries that they can laminate, put in the surgeries, explaining what they can and can't do, so that constituents can understand. For example, they can't overturn a decision that's been made. Going to your councillor doesn't mean that you'll be able to overturn your planning decision, and what they're allowed to do in terms of the code to help just manage expectations. We're also doing quite a lot of work with the media. We try to publicise our hearings. We publish all our decisions, even if it's a no-action decision. We publish those on the website as well, to try and educate the public, as well as respondents and councillors and members of public bodies about what is required of them and what's required in terms of the code. So it's something that we are definitely focusing on. We do get members of the public coming along to the hearings that we hold in person, and we live stream the ones that we hold online, and we do get quite a lot of people watching those hearings. It's hard to know exactly who they are, whether they're officers or whether they're members of the public or the media, but we've certainly seen an increase in media reporting on our decisions and our work.
I think that one of the difficulties that we've all probably got there is that a lot of members of the public probably wouldn't be aware of the code or how to maybe make a complaint or whatever until they feel that they need to, and that could come on quite suddenly. But so I think that might be part of the issue as well. Another question I had, Suzanne, you mentioned in your opening speech there about this issue around about, which I thought was really interesting actually, around about scrutinising decisions. And I know there was some media coverage on, councillors feeling that they couldn't scrutinise officers because of the code. I wondered if we could talk a wee bit more about that. Where do you think this line is about, between scrutinising officer decisions quite robustly, and where does that become a criticism? Because I tend to think, having been a councillor now, an MSP, in the same situations are in here in terms of scrutinising the government, sometimes it can be a bit of a fine line. Have you got any sort of thoughts on that, or any what advice has been given to councillors around this? Because I think this could be quite... I mean, obviously in some situations it's pretty obvious that a councillor's maybe just been critical and they're crossing a line, or that it's pretty obvious that they're just doing their job scrutinising. But I guess, is there a wee bit of a grey area there sometimes, where it's down to people's perceptions if they've been criticised, or if somebody's been too critical? Does that make sense?
Yes. I think it's similar to the questions that Mr. Stewart was asking earlier. And it's quite possible for several things to be true at the same time, I suppose. And firstly, I think councillors should differentiate between criticising the administration and decisions of the administration and criticising the actions or the nature of officers, if you like. So there's a very big difference between criticising actions or decisions taken by an administration and then criticising work of individual, identifiable members of council staff in public. Those two things, there's a big enough gap between those two things, I think, for a councillor to be able to perform highly effectively and carry out their scrutiny function. Does that make sense? Now, whether councillors always understand that in the heat of the moment, whether we are moving towards an increased commonality of narrative, if you like, where people think it's okay to be more personally critical is another question as well. I think there's something about the environment that increasingly councillors find themselves in. But I wanted to hand over to Lorna first.
Yeah, just to add to that, that we, within our training, our standard presentations, when we go out within our advice notes, we give examples of what might be acceptable to say, how you would challenge, how you would robustly scrutinise, and the difference between that and making a personal comment about the conduct or capability of an officer. We had 2 cases so far this year where we found that there's been a breach of the respect provision in relation to behaviours towards officers. And they're quite clear. One of them was calling on an officer to be suspended, threatening that officer with going to the police in respect of a delay about implementing something to do with a planning decision. And another one was on social media criticising an individual officer's capability to do their job, quite a junior officer, and it was an officer that had taken over the job from that councillor's husband. So I think they were quite clear examples of where the line had been crossed, essentially, where it was clearly a breach of the code. So I think it's up to us, I think, to try and really publicise a bit more information about what is okay and what is not okay, and that's something that we'll continue to work on.
Anything else, Fulton? Okay, great. Thumbs up. I'm now going to move over to questions from Alexander Stewart.
Thank you. You touched on already this morning about the sort of negative press that there has been about the code. And you've also talked about the work of the code and surveying it. And I think, you know, that there is training provided for councillors by the authority, the monitoring officer, and that will do. But also, I think, political groups try once again to give them guidance. A group leader or deputy group leader will try and support any of their council colleagues if they need that. There may well even be an appraisal system within the council group as to how councillors are performing or behaving that can be done internally to try and manage anyone's behaviour or anyone's ability to progress and who may need more training. You've talked about the surveys you've done in the past and that you're planning to do ones in the future. But it would be good to get a flavour of what you see that survey attempting to do. Is it there to try and ascertain if there's a knowledge gap? Or is it there to try and find out if there is areas for improvement or areas that maybe need to be re-examined to ensure that there is a transparency when it comes to the understanding of the code?
I think it's both. Yeah, I think it's to see whether there's actually any areas in the code that we could potentially amend to make it clearer. Well, we wouldn't amend it, we'd have to go through ministers, but that we could suggest be amended, or within the ethical standards framework within the legislation as well. But also just what we can do to help improve things. You know, if there's different ways that we can deliver training, you know, what's the take-up, you know, how many people read our advice notes, do they find them useful, what parts of them do they find useful? We certainly, last time we did these surveys, we really worked on our advice and guidance to put in much more examples so that councillors could really understand in practical terms. You know, they could apply the code to scenarios they might find themselves in rather than just reading black and white. We're trying to do lots more things like e-learning. We're trying to do more videos. We're actually going to be working with the Improvement Service and the Open University to, again, do some more kind of online training for councillors as well. So, yeah, that's what we're trying to establish, is basically how we can add more value within the parameters of our resources.
And, you know, the negative publicity there's been with reference to the code, how damaging is that, or does that have a reputational impact?
I'm not sure yet, to be honest. You know, we obviously we try and be as transparent as possible with our decisions. So we do always do a press release after a hearing. Like I say, we publish all our decisions on the website. So I like to think that people can go in and read them and understand, you know, that even if somebody has, like Ian said, has a vested interest and is maybe trying to push a certain narrative, that they can go in and actually look at the press releases, look at and say, well, actually, okay, that was a bit of a spin, and the actual reality was the complaint wasn't about that at all. The complaint was about this, and that's why it's been found. But again, with our resources being quite limited, it's not as if you know, every time there's something in the newspapers that I've got the resources to be able to go out and, you know, sort of say, well, can you interview me? Can we do a correction? Can I appear on this, or Suzanne appear on, you know, some radio show or whatever it is? So it is tricky to push back against that, but hopefully the quality of our decisions will speak for themselves.
Good. And I touched on the monitoring officer when I spoke to Ian earlier about their role, because when it comes to compliance and it becomes awareness, there needs to be parity across. And do you find that that is the case across the 32 local authorities, that the monitoring officer is aware of and trying to support when it comes to compliance and awareness of what is required? Because, you know, I'm quite pleased in some ways that there was the opportunity recently for a political party, which is my political party, to have a meeting with you. I instigated that in some way to ensure that that happened. And I think that is good for us to do, but there's a role within the compliance and monitoring officer within a council to try and do something similar.
Yeah, I think there is parity, actually. We have almost full attendance by monitoring officers at our annual workshops, and even if they can't come along, they send along a deputy. So we have, and we have these discussions with them, and I think all monitoring officers are aware that they can come to us and ask for assistance with training. It doesn't necessarily mean that we go out there and do it. We've got, you know, we can give them slides, we can give them case examples, that kind of thing. It can sometimes be difficult if they do have somebody who's subject to a hearing, an ongoing hearing, that they might feel it's not quite the right time to hold a training event. So it can depend, and also sometimes it also depends on whether they feel that they're going to get sufficient attendance. I think there's sometimes a reluctance to say to us, can you provide a training event, knowing the resources that takes from us, if they think that they're only going to get a certain number of councillors attending. So that's why, as I said earlier, we're trying to kind of push maybe more different ways of delivering that training and holding things like the webinars. We've got a video on of us just doing a standard presentation on our website as well on the code, and I think we can probably do a bit more work to publicise that as well, and maybe try and break some of those the bits down, so it's not somebody having to watch a whole, you know, hour-long presentation. Maybe just break down some bits of it. So I think that's again work that we can be doing a bit more on.
And one area that has an impact is the length of time that, if there is a breach of the code or something takes place, that has an impact on the training. Because if someone thinks, well, if there is an incident or there is a complaint, it's going to last quite some considerable time before there's a resolution to that. And how do you manage that within the process? Because that may put people off because they think a resolution may happen in a year or 2 years' time. So what's the point? Things have moved on. Yeah. Or does that still be the case that people still feel they want some kind of action at the end of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly a few years ago, there was a backlog with the investigation side, and that has now cleared. So we're seeing the referrals that are coming through to us are really quite up to date now. If we're holding a hearing, we do that within 6 to 12 weeks. The reason that we leave at least 6 weeks is to allow the parties time to prepare, essentially. So we think that's fair. But essentially now, complaints are being resolved really quite quickly. I think there's maybe a bit more information, that more work that we can do to publicise that, because I think in the past there maybe was a reluctance, especially by officers, to complain because of the reasons that Ian was talking about earlier, the fact that it could take so long, and that was having a detrimental effect on our hearings as well, because, you know, memories fade with time, and also emotions fade, I think, as well. So sometimes, even if you kind of had the sense that the behaviour was actually really bad, you would have a witness coming along and maybe saying something that was completely different to what they'd said in their original complaint form, you know, kind of watering it down a bit. But I think with the difference in the timescales now, and it's really significant improvement in terms of the overall timescale. So I think with that, hopefully those issues you know, have been addressed. But again, it's something that we could probably do a bit more to publicise. I don't want to create work for Ian with extra complaints coming in, but on the other hand, it is really important that the potential breaches of the code are looked at.
Thank you, Convener.
I'm now going to bring in Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Susie. Good morning, Lorna. If I could start off by talking about the the Commission's decision to limit the number of online hearings. I'd be interested to know your reasons for that decision and if there's been any positives or indeed consequences to making that decision as well.
Yeah, we actually didn't, I don't know, maybe I didn't word this very well in the annual report. We didn't actually limit them. We just reviewed the circumstances in which we would hold an online hearing. And as Susie said, we would hold them in circumstances where there's very little dispute about the factual basis of the complaint, you know, about, for example, if it was a social media post, yes, I accept, you know, I posted that, and the real debate is just whether it would amount to a breach of the code, the contents. So, yeah, so the reason that we've limited our online hearings to those kind of cases is because we've not experienced too many technical difficulties, but there is always that chance that someone's Wi-Fi will cut out in the middle of the hearing. We also find it a bit more difficult to communicate for the panel to communicate with each other during the hearing. You know, so it's quite difficult for the chair to be taking notes about what someone said, while also keeping an eye on the other panel members to see if they've got a question to ask. We did a bit of research, and I think there is research demonstrating that people find that kind of online hearing quite draining as well, quite tiring, more tiring than perhaps in person. It takes away the chance for me, if I'm going along to a hearing, to speak to the parties beforehand and make sure that any kind of issues that might need to be ironed out, or if they've got any questions, it takes away that opportunity as well. And the other thing we were slightly concerned, well, other two things was just maybe it takes a little bit of gravitas away from the hearing potentially, that people maybe just are a bit more informal online, and also just giving the local press and members of the public a chance to come along and actually sit in the room and watch the proceedings. So, yeah, those are the reasons that we're still trying to hold the majority of hearings in person. It is cheaper for us to do them online, and there's no question about that, because members' travel costs and just their time in travelling as well. But we do think it is quite important to hold them in person when we can.
No, that's really helpful, and thank you very much for the clarification as well regarding the decision or the reasons behind it too. There has been two cases where the respondent's conduct amounted to the breach of the code, but there seemed to be a conflict between the breach of the code and Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Yeah. What happens in that scenario, and do you anticipate there could be an increase in scenarios where you know, there is a breach of the code that has been in practice for a long period of time, but of course the appeal process and how it could actually conflict with the ECHR? Yeah,
I mean it does happen that the panel find on the face of it that the code has been breached. They think, oh, this behaviour is actually quite disrespectful on the face of it. But when you take into account the enhanced protection that most politicians who are acting in a political context will enjoy, the enhanced protection to their freedom of expression, we cannot make a formal finding and impose a sanction. We do have guidance on how we apply Article 10. We have guidance for councillors, we have guidance for members of public bodies. It is difficult because we would prefer that everybody behaved respectfully and that we didn't need to worry about Article 10 considerations, but the fact is we do under the law. So, yeah, I think we'll carry on trying to promote the code and promote respectful behaviour. And if it's the case that someone perhaps doesn't behave respectfully, then we will have to take into account the right to freedom of expression before we make that final decision on whether we can make that formal finding or not.
I think it's how you measure that as well, of course, because it could have a different meaning to different people at different times. And I think, you know, it is important, you know, that whilst councillors should behave respectfully towards each other, I think you've outlined, particularly in your open remarks and certainly in questions to other members of the committee, that there can be scenarios where tensions are heightened, and, you know, certain behaviours are not necessarily that behaviour of the individual continuously. It's more just that could be, you know, a spun of the moment thing, or, you know, a one-off occasion too. My final question is in relation to what happened last year, because last year the Commissioner and the Standards Commission wrote to the Scottish Government asking for a change in the legislation. Yep. I would just be interested to know, you know, has there been any progress? You know, what's happened? Is there dialogue with the Scottish Government? And any further information that you want to give in relation to that change in legislation that you're calling for?
Yeah, so essentially we've been advised that there's no legislative vehicle in this parliamentary session, but they will hopefully look at it next session. In the meantime, we have had correspondence with government officers asking, you know, a few questions about what this means, what you're, you know, what you're just asking for clarification. So there is kind of ongoing dialogue.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. I think it's going to be a very busy next parliamentary term, convener. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Yep, we're definitely getting a lot of things lined up. Well, that concludes our questions. So many thanks to Lorna and Susie for your evidence this morning. And we previously agreed to take the next items on our agenda in private. So that concludes the public part of the meeting, and we'll move into private. Thanks a lot.